Hello everyone. In this video, we will discuss how to create a recursive lambda function in C++. First of all, can a lambda function be recursive? Yes, a lambda function in C++ can be recursive. However, lambda functions cannot refer to themselves by default. So we need a special change to allow them to refer to themselves. So let's start. There are two different techniques. For a recursive function, we will create a lambda function to calculate the factorial of a number. So we will start with a capture block, and inside the parameter list we will pass an cost integer reference, say cost int value. Now inside the lambda function body we will first check if the value is less than equal to 1, then we can just return 1. And in the else block we will return value multiplied by the factorial of value minus 1. Now to calculate the factorial of value minus 1, we need to somehow call this lambda function recursively. So we can say factorial value minus 1. But what is this factorial? We want to refer to a lambda function here. What if we store our lambda function here? Auto factorial equals to and the lambda function body. Now as you can see, there are still compile errors. If you check the error, so it will say the factorial function is declared as auto and it cannot deduce its type inside the function definition body. Okay, so the exact error is a variable declared with an auto type specifier cannot appear in its own initializer list. So instead of auto, we need to specify the complete type of this lambda function using std function. So we will say std function, and as a template parameter we will say int, because this function will return integer, and here we will say cost int reference, the parameter. So here we have declared the complete type of the variable that is going to store this lambda function. But still there is a problem. This factorial variable is still not available inside the function body because it's declared outside the lambda function. So we need to pass this factorial variable as a reference inside the lambda function's body. So now there are no errors. So if we see, factorial variable is accessible inside the lambda function's body. Now to invoke this function, we can say stdcout to print the value returned by this function, and then factorial and 7, and then print the end line character. So now if we run this code, there are no compile errors, so it will return the factorial of 7. So basically what just happened here, we declared a lambda function, and inside the lambda function we referred or called the same lambda function. So this is a recursive lambda function, and to call this lambda function recursively we can access the variable that stores the lambda function. Now to make sure that this variable is accessible inside the lambda function body, we need to pass the ampersand character inside the capture block, and also we need to provide the complete declaration of the type of this variable that is going to store the lambda function. When we pass an ampersand in the capture block, all the other variables which are declared in this block, for example int n equals to 10, now n will also be accessible or available inside the lambda function body. So if you don't want all the variables to be passed as a reference inside the lambda function body, what we can do, we can just pass the factorial here. So now if we run the code again, we can see it will give the factorial of 7, but here n will not be present as a reference inside the function definition. Only the variable factor will be present as a reference inside this body of the lambda function. Now this was the first way to call a lambda function recursively, but there is another way which is much shorter. We don't need to provide this big declaration and all. We can use auto here, and let's improve the indentation, and we don't need to pass anything in the capture block. Now instead of just the value, we need to pass the reference to this lambda function as a parameter here. So that can be done using auto self. Now the self here points to the same lambda function which we are defining here. So we have passed that lambda function as a argument here. So now if we improve this, inside the if block we are not referring to the same lambda function. here in this return statement we are trying to call the same lambda function. So we will say self, and as a first parameter we will pass self. Now we can see it's still showing certain compile errors because here we are passing only one parameter, whereas in our lambda function accepts two different parameters. First one is the same lambda function. So we will say like this, factorial, comma factorial and 7. So in this lambda function body, we accept the same lambda function as a first parameter, and as a second parameter is in constant integer reference. Now in this particular line we are calling this lambda function recursively. So we are using self to refer to the same lambda function. So now if we run this code, we can see that it still prints the factorial of 7. So this is the second way, and it's much shorter way. We don't need to provide the complete declaration of the variable. We can just use the auto here. So these are the two different ways to call a lambda function recursively. If you found this video interesting and helpful, then don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Also, you can refer to our website cpvjournal.com for the complete tutorial. Bye for now.